Hi, my name is Drew Williams, and I am one of the principal security consultants with Guidacent. And today we're going to talk about the consequences and the ramifications associated with the recent SolarWinds attack. That hack, which was imposed by a foreign national organization, impacted more than 18,000 businesses worldwide, hit all of the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, the top 5 accounting firms in the United States, and 425 of the Fortune 500. So it had significant impact. And today we're not going to get in the weeds, but we are going to discuss some of the causes of this particular event, what happened, a little bit of a timeline, and then talk about some of the things that organizations can do right now to reduce their risk of compromise and reduce their risk of threat. The problem associated with a supply chain security issue like this is you can never really be completely confident of success in thwarting these kinds of attacks. What you're trying to do is create your infrastructure as quiet as possible so that the bad guy goes someplace else. So that's what we're going to cover today. And of course, if there's any question or you want to have any kind of follow-up with the teams, feel free to reach out to somebody at Guidacent and we can help you with that. So here we go. Let's talk about this a little bit more. So this little scary story actually begins in December of last year, when Reuters broke a news story that the U.S. Treasury Department had been infiltrated by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service through a series of Trojan exploits that it had planted into the code of a managed service provider based in Austin, Texas called SolarWinds. And this attack, by the way, has been referred to by some cybersecurity teams as the hack of the century. And the SolarWinds breach itself is sending shockwaves through U.S. government agencies all the way up to Capitol Hill and out beyond the 452 of the Fortune 500 companies that were impacted, given the high-profile nature of this situation and the target systems that were compromised. So in the next few minutes, I want to share with you the highlights of this attack and point out some of the key elements that made this so effective. Also, given the complexity of this attack, this presentation is designed to serve as a point of reference rather than as a comprehensive review, also known as death by PowerPoint. That's not something we're going to be doing here. There's only a handful of slides and there won't be a quiz. And what we're hoping to achieve is that organizations will be sufficiently aware of what happened and why you might want to reconsider your own threat posture, as it were. Also, we'll discuss a few courses of action that everyone should consider taking regardless of your business size, which will greatly reduce your respective vulnerability footprint as you conduct your day-to-day operations. So here it is in a quick short summary. These attackers, a state-funded organization called APT29, delivered malware through the SolarWinds remote management system to thousands of targets, and the attackers compromised the build system for one of the SolarWinds remote management system applications called Orion, using a combination of advanced persistent threat tactics, or APT tactics. Orion, by the way, is a monitoring product which is used by MSPs all over the world to gain access and manage systems and operations of clients subscribing to this service. The Orion hack, which is also referred to as Sunburst, enabled the bad guys to deliver Trojanized updates to thousands of customers for at least 4 months between September and Christmas of last year. And it may have actually been longer. We're still learning the real impact, which may take more months, if not years, into investigation. And based on the early findings and the fallout that we've seen so far, this was an attack that was primarily targeting various U.S. government organizations, which included the State Department and all of the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces and their respective subsidiaries. And not to add insult to injury, but here's another interesting fact. The perpetrators were also able to gain access to some of Microsoft's internal source code, which is considered the holy grail by cybercrime organizations all over the world. And what would a security briefing be without at least one slide full of statistics to look at? But these actually do have some bearing. Recent data out of Gartner and Ponemon show that the damage related to cybercrime is projected to hit $6 trillion annually by the end of this year alone. And it's no surprise, of the 29 vital statistics being collected in the Ponemon research, among the big ones is the $133 billion on global spending on cybersecurity by the end of next year. And again, interesting how this APT campaign, which was extremely costly associated with the businesses that were affected, was a slow boil effort. in which the attackers planted beacons 4 months prior to the actual initiated attack. And then they waited and worked slowly behind the scenes for the system to quiet back down. And in fact, this attack campaign exploited legitimate software and remote access updates, which is again something that's hidden in the background that we don't really track. Okay, enough with statistics, but let's point out one more thing. This isn't the first time that SolarWinds technology has been exploited. A zero-day vulnerability in SolarWinds MSP's remote monitoring and management tool, which may be related to this, we still don't know, which they documented and announced all the way back in January of last year, allowed attackers to steal the administrative credentials of an account holder. So was that tied to this? We're still looking at that, and a lot of folks are debating that. But as time rolled on in this particular case, these hackers deliberately maintained a low profile while working on the execution of this attack, which is the standard modus operandi for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. I've seen this for the last 20 years. This is how they work. They work very, very quietly in the background and wait to the key point of time on their calendar to strike, and it causes the greatest level of exploit. In this case, these guys targeted any exposed remote desktop protocol or RDP ports or potentially compromised accounts through credential harvesting campaigns, phishing campaigns, or a combination, which would be picked up by beacon or through a compromised point of access, which is one of the more common methods for gaining access into MSP environments. In fact, a lot of the security people refer to RDP as the ransomware delivery platform because of the ease by which the RDP can be exploited for access. And this attack is classified as a supply chain attack, which was, as I mentioned, deployed to more than 18,000 organizations, which means potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of affected endpoints. The malware used to exploit SolarWinds was hidden as legitimate code and blended into the background as an updated DLL. The malware inserted into SolarWinds Orion masquerades its network traffic and stores reconnaissance results within legitimate plugin configuration files, and that allows it to blend in with legitimate SolarWinds activity. And as we saw with this particular backdoor, it uses multiple obfuscated block lists to identify forensic and antivirus tools running as processes, services, and drivers. So it just masquerades in the background, like I said. The attackers named, and this is where I think the impetus just really comes into reviewing in greater detail what we're deploying as code. The attackers actually named their set of tasks the Orion Improvement Business Layer. And through that system, they were able to mask their activities into legitimate operations, blending in with the rest of the code, as I mentioned before. And this type of class application contains all of the backdoor capabilities comprising 13 subclasses and 16 methods with strings obfuscated to further hide malicious code. Very, very difficult to pick up. So here's the thing. This attack is a very, very common way in which the bad guy gets access. The whole Trojan cloak and dagger model I've seen taking place for close to 30 years in the cybersecurity space, and it certainly predates that. So not something new, but it is something that continues to work very effectively. Okay, so now let's talk about the command and control function of this attack, which is really where the rubber hits the road. And I don't want to get into the weeds too deeply, but at least we can kind of highlight these key 6 points of reference. And with respect to this particular attack, the software builds that SolarWinds used for updating Orion versions released between March 2020 and June 2020 included a Trojan payload that was planted long before then. At least that's what the forensics are now showing. Further analysis of the SolarWinds software has suggested that their code was altered as early as October of 2019, although the first weaponized software updates, denoted as Sunburst, as I mentioned before, were not released until March of last year. And as already noted, the attackers managed to modify the Orion platform using their business layer DLL plugin, which again is distributed as part of the SolarWinds platform updates. The hackers exploited admin permissions acquired through on-premises compromises of SolarWinds Orion to access a targeted trusted token signing certificate, which allowed them to forge tokens that impersonate any of the organization's existing accounts or users, including highly privileged accounts. And again, providing command and control through remote management systems routed through an MSP, same style of access as we see time and time again in this kind of activity. And following an initial period of dormancy so that the network would then quiet back down, which is often the case of this type of APT attack, as I mentioned before, hackers then allow the system to settle into somewhat unsuspecting lull, as it were, followed by a planned and coordinated attack. And in this case, the Trojan retrieved and executed commands called jobs, which included the ability to transfer files, execute file commands, profile the system, reboot the machine, and disable system services, all masquerading its network traffic as part of the system's improvement program protocol. Meanwhile, the coded backdoor uses multiple obfuscated block lists, as I mentioned before, to identify forensic and antivirus tools running as processes, services, and so on. And then they deploy a weaponized version of the Cobalt Strike beacon to further penetrate into thousands of systems. So not to add any further shadow to the dumpster fire that was the year 2020 for many organizations, but this nightmare before Christmas actually began far earlier in the season. Some of the research that was done by Palo Alto Networks is associated with their DNS security log lookup, which in a range between April and November, they saw a gradual increase in the call out for this particular update, which shows how the code was deployed in the system. And why is that important? Because that kind of trail will allow us to at least pinpoint when most of the activity was taking place associated with this deployment. Now, as I mentioned, Microsoft and most of the associated partners in the field seized control of the compromised domain on December 15th, and then they used a form of kill switch to command and instruct the Sunburst code to terminate itself and further prevent further execution from causing greater compromise in the system. Now, this process that the bad guys used had lots of moving parts, but there were three really key issues. Number one, gain access into the supply chain infrastructure. Number two was gain command and control. And then number three, change the Federation Trust certificates, which really meant going in under the wire so that it was never noticed. The other problem with this was that this organization had been planted into this infrastructure a long, long time. When I say a long time, I'm saying more than 4 months. So there was plenty of time for it to move around, get into the system, pivot from its entry point, and collect information as it needed so that it could launch the appropriate attack at the right time. And let's talk about that a little bit more with respect to some of the details associated with that timeline. So like I mentioned, this is a classic attack kill chain campaign, and for the sake of brevity, there are three key phases of this attack objective that I want to cover. In the first phase of this attack, the Orion update package was deployed to more than 18,000 organizations, as I mentioned before. In the second phase, Sunburst then performed DNS lookups to a subdomain encoded with information about the specific local environment that they were targeting. A CNAME response then, back to the request, initiated a custom HTTPS tunnel, which was included in the compromised code. Then, as part of the third phase, attackers leveraged service or admin accounts present on the target server, as well as Windows admin tools that supported remote code execution to move laterally from the SolarWinds system deeper into various target networks. And once they acquired domain admin, the hackers were free to move to the ADFS server, where they acquired the SAML signing certificate, modified certificate authorities, and then were able to use attacker-owned certificates and credentials to validate their masqueraded identity. And that's when we start to see the real ownership take place. Using stolen certificates to forge new SAML tokens, these guys were able to access the Azure Active Directory system with admin permissions. The group was able to gain access to applications, including email archiving, which is the gold, which also provided further access to email directories for other groups. And at this point, the attackers had access to email and specific user accounts, where they could also further leverage native Office 365 tools like eDiscovery and Power Automate to harvest specific data that they were hunting. Again, they're using this information for a range of activities, notwithstanding anything that's already on the table, but also on future compromises. Okay, so what was the fallout of all of this, and how did the chips fall after the fact? For starters, this event has caused major cybersecurity ripples throughout thousands of high-profile organizations, as well as hundreds of mid-enterprise companies, universities, colleges, and organizations in all 16 critical infrastructures. In fact, The National Security Council held an emergency session last Saturday to discuss containment and recovery, so I don't think this is going to end anytime soon. And as I mentioned earlier, this attack involved hackers compromising SolarWinds infrastructures, which produced a network of applications and monitoring platforms in their portfolio that has affected hundreds of businesses and thousands of organizations all over the place. If anybody does business with any of those kinds of organizations, the chances of collateral risk becomes a bit more elevated. Also, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has sent out an advisory as well that the attackers may have used other initial access points besides SolarWinds, which may include other MSPs that may leverage the same type of architecture. And there's a lot of debate going on as to which organizations were actually affected, certainly which of the security organizations that were affected. And we know that FireEye was affected because it was Kevin Mandian's team that actually discovered this situation in the first place. But there are some reports that are showing Cisco, some reporting other large security companies and hospitals, large medical facilities and utility companies and power companies. So there's a lot of speculation as far as where the impact is going to be felt and how far into the system and into the infrastructure that we're going to feel this. Stay tuned. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of folks who are going to be reporting on this. Even though it has quieted down somewhat in the news, it is still very relevant to the operation of this country and its 16 critical infrastructures. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do. Training, making sure everybody's aware of what a phishing campaign looks like and why it's important not to be fooled. What is a credential harvest and what can it mean by way of compromising the infrastructure and what can it mean long term? Have we adopted a robust security framework like NIST 800 or ISO 27K or ITIL or something along those lines? ITIL is a little more of an IT infrastructure, but still there are components associated with that as well. How about processes? Looking at zero trust. Do we understand what zero trust means to the business? When was the last time a comprehensive security assessment was performed? And what did you do with the information that you discovered based on the results of that assessment? What about identity and access management and principles of least privilege? I go back to this all the time. Least privilege means getting access to something for a limited time while you need it and then removing those privileges. And no matter where you are in your role or your responsibilities within an organization, nobody should have ubiquitous power over all things all the time. So these are just a couple of talking points that we can look at. Here are a few others. Now, I've mentioned a few of these already, and certainly the ones that are most important, I think, as I mentioned, are identity and access management, principles of least privilege, and so on. But really 4 areas of focus. The individual component, where individuals within the organization really need to be aware of their surroundings, the training I had mentioned before. Do we understand what social engineering is and what the impact is to the business? And when you see something, say something immediately. That's so important. From a business perspective, making sure that that framework is fully adopted from the top all the way down. Everybody understands their respective roles and what those parts are, what those components are that will impact the business, and what those relationships are, and whether or not those organizations that are downrange from the supply chain or in the organization or extended beyond the organization also share in a common framework of sorts. Whether that, again, is ITIL or ISO 27K or NIST, is obviously, subjective. What are the processes associated with your quality assurance model in your development cycles? Of course, zero trust being paramount in the process as well. And that security assessment is so important. And what were the findings? And what did you do with those findings? And how did you internalize those findings? And certainly the technology itself. Least privilege issues, identity and access management. How do we get the network as quiet as possible so that we can protect those sacred components of the business or the crown jewels? Very, very important elements. Not definitive, but certainly a great start to making sure that the infrastructure is somewhat more secure. And remember, above all else, compliance never equals security. That's a very, very important issue, and we'll talk about that in a future webcast. We might also consider that organizations need to be in constant dialogue with their respective partner suppliers, ensuring they too are following best practices like checking the integrity of their code, checking their systems repeatedly for any indications of compromise. And this isn't going to be just a one and done conversation. It's got to be an ongoing process. So the whole SolarWinds breach situation also illustrates another problem we usually see as a regular issue in data center IT security, which ties back to working outside of the silo environments and more closely aligned with the broader IT teams throughout an organization. The guys over at Ponemon Institute are making a lot of noise about data centers now taking a zero trust model much more seriously. And just as a way of general level setting for those who may not be familiar with this term, the main concept behind zero trust is that network devices such as laptops should not be trusted by default, even if they're connected to a managed corporate network such as a corporate LAN, even if they've also already been verified. And by the way, the topic of zero trust will be discussed in a future webcast, so stay tuned for that, and we look forward to sharing that information with you forthcoming. So before we wrap everything up, I guess we want to talk about what we can do to reduce the risk of impact from this particular event, as well as anything in the future that may be similar to this. And some security teams are suggesting that this is going to require a bare metal refresh, and that means taking things out completely of the system and starting from scratch, which of course isn't practical. And it's expensive and it's time consuming. So we're once again in a Mobius between risk tolerance and defense by design. And certainly greater visibility into what organizations actually do to maintain security is going to go a long way to addressing risk overall. And that said, this whole SolarWinds cyber attack serves as a sobering notification regarding the need to be constantly mindful of the threats that lurk deep within third-party vendor supply chains. And that starts with basic cybersecurity hygiene. At the very least, and regardless of whether you're a global enterprise or a small family-operated business in small-town USA, your company should ensure it's taking certain measures to protect those assets that are at the core of your business success. From a security operations perspective, it's a really good idea to understand where those core assets and related data reside within your infrastructure. And also, make sure everyone in the organization understands how that data and those assets are appropriately classified, and if the right system controls are in place, including effective and comprehensive tools for auditing and event detection and notification. And other important takeaways from this situation relates to how organizations and sources access your network, and not to assume that unusual outbound network traffic is harmless just because, for example, even when sourced to a trusted application. And finally, making sure everyone who has access to the assets within your organization and those folks who are not part of the company but still have access have need for that access, but only for the period of time necessary to do a specific set of tasks. And that again is part of the principles of least privilege. And so it really comes down to this. When deploying any new apps or technology of any sort into any network or any network size in any infrastructure, organizations are going to have to start asking themselves the question, at least for the time being, what would happen if this app or system was compromised because of some malicious activity that was sent across as a legitimate process? That's the kind of activity that we're seeing with these new sophisticated attacks. And with that, look forward to more conversations like this and stay tuned. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to somebody at Guidacent and we'd be happy to talk with you further about any follow-up services we might be able to provide. So thanks again.